Today I will be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you are beginner or have some experience with crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. For this project we'll need a few basic supplies: a crochet hook size 4 mm, gum medium weight, scissors, a darning needle for weaving in ends, handband, handless, optional. You can crochet handle as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step 1: starting chain. First, we'll create a foundation. Chain hairs made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not twisted once you finish. Step 2: first row 2330. Next, we will work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitch of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tensions throughout so your bag stays neat and even. Step 3: building the bag. Once the first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to make a turning chain. Keep repeating the rows and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. When the height of the bag looks good, we'll start working on the side. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches, which will make the bag more sturdy and double. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Step 5. Now it's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. If you are crocheting the handles, you can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Step 6. Now for the finished touch, you can round or shape the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose ends with a darning needles to make the bag neat and tidy. Consolations. And there you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or if something wants clear, feel free to leave comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! This English voiceover script will guide you smoothly through the crochet handbag tutorial. Thanks for watching, viewers. Remember, make your prayers. Stay with me. Take care. Welcome to our crochet tutorial. Today we'll be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you were beginner or have some experience with crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. For this project we'll need a few basic supplies: a crochet hook, yarn medium weight, scissors, a draining needle for weaving in ends, handbag handless optional. You can crochet handless as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step starting chain. First we'll create a foundation chain. Here we have made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not twist once you finish. Next will you on the first row begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitch of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tensions throughout so your bag stay neat and even. Step 3. Building the bag. Once the first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to make a turning chain. Keep repeating the row and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. Step 4. Sides and height. When the height of the bag look good, we will start working on the side. For the side, we'll use simple single crochet stitches, which will make the bag more sturdy and double. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Now it's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. You were crocheting the handles. You can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Now for the finishing touch, you can round or shape the corner of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose ends with drumming needles to make the bag neat and tidy. And there you have it. Your crocheted handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. You have any question, or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! Sure, here's the voiceover script for the crochet handbag tutorial in English. Hello everyone and welcome to our crochet tutorial. Today we'll be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you are a beginner or have some experience with the crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. Materials for this project will need a few basic supplies: a crochet work size 4 mm yarn medium weight, scissors, a draining needle for weaving in ends, handbag handless optional. You can crochet handless as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step 1. Starting chain. First we'll create a foundation chain. Here we have made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not turned once you finish. Step 2. Next we'll work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitches of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tension throughout so your bag stay neat and even. Step 3, building the bag. Once their first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to take and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. When the height of the bag looks good, we'll start working on the sides. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches which will make the bag more sturdy and durable. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Step 5. Now it's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. If you are crocheting the handles, you can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Step 6. Now for the finished touch, you can round or shape the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose end with the darning needle to make the bag neat and tidy. Conclusion. And there you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any question or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! This English voiceover script will guide you smoothly through the crochet handbag tutorials. It's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. And here you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any question or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Now for the finished touch, you can round or shape the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to use in any loose ends with a darning needle to make the bag neat and tidy. When the height of the bag look good, we'll start working on the side. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches which will make the bag more sturdy and durable. As you crochet the side, you will see your bag starting to take shape. We will work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitch of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tension throughout so your bag stays neat and even. a drumming needle handbag handle channel. Today I will be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you are beginner or have some experience with crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. For this project, we'll need a few basic supplies: a crochet hook size 4 mm, yarn medium weight, scissors, a darning needle for weaving in ends, handband, handless, optional. You can crochet handle as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step 1: starting chain. First, we'll create a foundation. Chain hairs, made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not twisted once you finish. Step 2: first row 2330. Next, we will work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitch of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tensions throughout so your bag stays neat and even. Step 3: building the bag. Once the first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to make a turning chain. Keep repeating the rows, and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. When the height of the bag looks good, we'll start working on the side. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches. which will make the bag more sturdy and durable. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Step 5. Now it's time to add the handle. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. If you were crocheting the handles, you can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Step 6. Now for the finished touch, you can round or shapes the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose ends with a darning needles to make the bag neat and tidy. Consolations. And there you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or if something wants clear, feel free to leave comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! This English voiceover script will guide you smoothly through the crochet handbag tutorial. Thanks for watching, viewers. Remember, make your prayers stay with me. Take care. welcome to our crochet tutorial. Today we'll be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you were beginner or have some experience with crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. For this project, we'll need a few basic supplies: a crochet hook, yarn medium weight, scissors, a draining needle for weaving in ends, handbag handless optional. You can crochet handless as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step starting chain. First, we'll create a foundation chain. Here we have made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not twist once you finish. Next, will you on the first row bag, begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitch of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tensions throughout so your bag stay neat and even. Step 3. Building the bag. Once the first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to make a turning chain. Keep repeating the row and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. Step 4. Sides and height. When the height of the bag looks good, we will start working on the side. For the side, we'll use simple single crochet stitches, which will make the bag more sturdy and double. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Now it's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. You were crocheting the handles. You can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Now for the finishing touch, you can round or shape the corner of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose ends with drumming needles to make the bag neat and tidy. Adhere you have it, your crocheted handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. You have any question, or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! Sure, here's the voiceover script for the crochet handbag tutorial in English. Hello everyone and welcome to our crochet tutorial. Today we'll be making a beautiful crochet handbag. Whether you are a beginner or have some experience with the crochet, this video is perfect for you. So let's get started. Materials for this project will need a few basic supplies: a crochet work size 4mm yarn, medium weight, scissors, a draining needle for weaving in ends, handbag handless optional. You can crochet handless as well. Now that we have everything ready, let's begin. Step 1. Starting chain. First we'll create a foundation chain. Here we have made 30 chains, but you can adjust the number based on your desired bag size. Make sure your chain is not turned once you finish. Step 2. Next we'll work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second stitches of your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tension throughout so your bags stay neat and even. Step 3. Building the bag. Once their first row is complete, we'll move to the next row. For each new row, remember to take and the size of your bag will gradually increase. You can adjust the number of rows depending on how tall or short you want your bag. When the height of the bag looks good, we'll start working on the sides. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches which will make the bag more sturdy and durable. As you crochet the sides, you will see your bag starting to take shape. Step 5. Now it's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. If you are crocheting the handles, you can create strong handles by using simple chain and slip stitches. Step 6. Now for the finish touch, you can round or shape the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to weave in any loose end with the darning needle to make the bag neat and tidy. Conclusion. And there you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any question or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Happy crocheting! This English voiceover script will guide you smoothly through the Crochet handbag tutorial. It's time to add the handles. If you have ready-made handles, it's very easy to attach them. And here you have it. Your crochet handbag is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any question or if someone was not clear, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more crochet tutorials. Now for the finished touch, you can round or shape the corners of your bag to your liking. Don't forget to use in any loose ends with a darning needle to make the bag neat and tidy. When the height of the bag look good, we'll start working on the side. For the sides, we'll use simple single crochet stitches which will make the bag more sturdy and durable. As you crochet the side, you will see your bag is starting to take shape. We will work on the first row. Begin by doing a double crochet into the second. Stitch off your chain. Continue this for every chain. Be mindful of maintaining consistent tension throughout so your bag stays neat and even. A drumming needle